Okay, welcome everybody. Good evening. Good evening. Good to see you. I want to welcome you all to this Bridges Collaborative Public Forum. We're so excited to have it. And we've got three very, very special guests whom I'm going to introduce in just 1 second. I want to handle a few logistics first. And the first thing I want to do is that I just want to extend a very warm welcome to the city of Baltimore, where I live, to all of our wonderful Bridges Collaborative members from across the country. So welcome. We're so excited to have you. We're going to do a more extensive set of welcomes and introductions tomorrow morning when we kick off our day of learning and of collaboration. But for now, welcome to the city. We're excited to get started. The other thing I wanted to mention is we've got folks joining us online, and some of those folks may not be familiar with the Bridges Collaborative, so I wanted to just very briefly introduce the collaborative, what we do. We are an initiative of the Century Foundation, and the Century Foundation is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. and in New York City. And the Century Foundation's mission is to conduct research, develop solutions, and drive policy to make people's lives better. And one of the ways the Century Foundation has done that is by launching the Bridges Collaborative, which we started 2 years ago. And we started the Bridges Collaborative with the mission of dramatically increasing the number of seats for children in this country in schools that are diverse, inclusive, integrated, and rigorous. And we do that in 3 ways. We do that first by fostering collaboration among practitioners in the worlds of housing and of education. We do that second by offering strategic support using the research that we conduct and policy. And the third way that we want to do that is by changing the national narrative on school integration. And we've been engaged in that work with you all over the last 2 years. It's been really exciting work. For those of you who are interested in learning more, you can visit www.tcf.org. During the event tonight, we want you to tweet out your reactions to the things that you're hearing using the hashtag Bridges Collaborative. And then finally, we invite all of you to join us for a happy hour following this. All of you who are here in person, of course. If you're here online, if you're watching online, you can't come down and join us, unfortunately. Come join us afterward. And we're going to start bright and early tomorrow for our day of learning at 9 a.m. with some remarks from Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, and of course have our keynote with Maya Wiley tomorrow at 9 a.m. So without further ado, I want to introduce our esteemed panel here. I want to start on our far left with Liz Bowie. Liz Bowie is a reporter education reporter with the Baltimore Banner. Ms. Bowie, prior to joining the Banner, was at the Baltimore Sun for 35 years and has won numerous awards for her work, including was a team of journalists who won a Pulitzer for local reporting in 2020 with the Baltimore Sun. Welcome, Liz Bowie. In the middle, we've got State Superintendent Mohammed Choudhury. Mohammed Choudhury was named State Superintendent on July 1st of 2020, so he's 2021, excuse me. So he's relatively new on the job. He's like, it hasn't been that long, has it? And prior to joining the department, Mohammed Choudhury worked in Dallas, worked in San Antonio, and worked in Los Angeles, was a teacher in Los Angeles. He's been a strong advocate for school integration and had made significant progress in integrating schools in both Dallas and in San Antonio. We're so pleased to have you here. Welcome, Superintendent Choudhury. And then closest to me on the stage, we've got State Senator Bill Ferguson. Senator Ferguson has been the president of the Maryland Senate since 2020. He represents parts of Baltimore City, where he lives with his wife and 2 kids. And Senator Ferguson, you were a teacher in Baltimore City, a history teacher, if I'm not mistaken, right here in Baltimore City. And we are just so lucky to have all 3 of you. So without further ado, our esteemed panel, I'm going to pass it over to you, Liz, to take it away. Thank you.
Mohammed, you promoted school diversity in Dallas and San Antonio, as we just heard, And Senator Ferguson, you sponsored legislation to allow persistently failing schools to be transformed into regional magnet schools that would foster diversity. That legislation failed, we should add. Why do you two think the issue of school integration is important right now?
Sure. Is this on? Yeah, there you go. Why is it important right now? It's been important forever. It is the thing that we have not done in this country. We tried once, forcefully, and at the height of it, we made a lot of progress in this country. A lot of research has come out showing the children during the desegregation era and what it's done to their lives, not just educationally, but also just economic mobility, and so many other things as well. I mean, we know segregation leads to you living less longer in life. And there's so many, I mean, if you don't believe me, look at Raj Chetty's research. So when you say now, it's weird for me to say that. It's been important forever. But if I'm going to say now, right, I mean, the country, some people may argue, is divided even more than we have been. And frankly, if we are not hanging out with each other, especially living next to each other and sending your most precious cargo, because I know I have a 3-month-old, to school with someone else and being able to do that and invest that time, we're never going to be able to really truly get along and dispel all of the different ugly myths and fallacies that we have of one another. So for me, as state superintendent, in order to drive proficiency rates, in order to drive college going rates, in order to have better workforce outcomes, we need integrated schools to be a front and center strategy.
Well, first, it is such a pleasure to be here with two kind of Maryland all-stars, folks that know this issue better than most nationally, but particularly how it impacts here in Maryland. You know, I didn't start at a place of thinking that socioeconomic integration was the core reform needed. That wasn't my kind of initial theory of change until, you know, I think it was both being a teacher in what was Southwest Baltimore, and I grew up in Rockville, which is a suburb outside of DC. It was a wonderful place to grow up, but a lot of folks had very similar backgrounds as me, and so everyone had their own social safety net. They had a lot of supports, and so it was very easy for me to look around and think, well, if you just work hard, you're successful, and if you don't work hard, you're not, because that's the world that I saw. And when I started teaching in West Baltimore, and I taught 9th, 10th, and 11th graders, you know, what became very obvious to me immediately was that the challenges that the majority of my students faced every single day just getting to and from school were harder than any challenge I had faced in my entire life. And I just could not, in my wildest dreams, understand the depth of inequity that existed from the high school experience I had versus the high school experience that my students were having on a daily basis. And, you know, I don't think that it is an absolute, so I believe it is absolutely important to pursue the objective of socioeconomic integration. I don't think it is the only means, but I do think that if we look across our educational history, the times when we were closing the achievement gap the most, in which everyone was benefiting the most, were the periods where integration was at its highest point. And then after Supreme Court cases came out and those programs were sort of largely dismantled and we sort of reverted to a mean, we've seen the gaps widen further and further and further. And it's not just about schools, of course, it's about housing. I think that you all were touring the city. But if, you know, I think it is both important for academic outcomes, but more and more and more, especially in these last few years, I think it is important for democracy and civilization, because I very much worry that we are just becoming more and more and more sort of us versus them, and the further apart we are in every aspect of life, the easier it is to otherize and create the divisions that I think we're seeing.
You both are in positions of power to do something about this, so to promote school integration in Maryland. So do you have any plans? You want to announce them this afternoon?
So I'm glad to start by saying I've had a lot of plans and all of them have failed. Not all of them, but a lot of them. You know, I've put forward a number of different, I've tried to go at it in very different ways. And, you know, obviously I sit in a little bit of a different vantage point than I used to, where I represented. So welcome to the Fight in 46th District, the home of the greatest state legislative district in the state of Maryland. So I'm glad you get to visit it here at AVAM and this incredible institution. But I care deeply, deeply about the city. From this new vantage point as a presiding officer, I'm trying to take a bit of a statewide viewpoint, but of course, where I live and where I represent is the most important. The challenge we have in Maryland in particular is that we have 24 counties, and a lot of our counties are pretty homogeneous. There are several marked examples, and that's Montgomery and Howard, which are two of the most diverse counties. But for the most part, with Prince George's and Baltimore City, which are majority minority, there's not a lot of diversity by county when you look at the numbers as a whole. And so if you were to create a largely socioeconomic school in the city of Baltimore, it's very difficult to do by maintaining within these invisible lines between counties. And so the only real strategy that can racially integrate schools is by doing inter-county enrollment. And that is a very, very challenging feature. So we created this thing called EDCO, which was the Education Development Collaborative, which was about best practices as encouraging it. It never got funded. We put in, I had amendments that got onto bills and then stripped off of bills that would have allowed the option of kind of magnet schools, voluntary choice. And so where we are right now is we have enormous amounts of school construction going into the state. And there is a report due actually on July 1st that is looking at the schools. Every district has to say the school and the socioeconomic diversity of the neighborhoods around it to see where the disparities exist. And we think that there's an opportunity down the line to use state dollars around schools and new construction to encourage or incentivize more integration, but we don't have a specific policy in place yet.
I'm new, so finishing up my first year, but, and I mean, if anyone who knows me, including the state board who hired me, right, it's an issue that I'm not going to try to do something about. But the question is, what does that look like at the state level? I can tell you what I've done in districts and what that looks like, from open enrollment to even taking on boundary work, which is one of the hardest, as we know, even in our own backyard here, such as the tensions that happen in Howard County. But there's a lot of things I can do at the moment over time, such as grant making, right? How we design grants does matter. For example, we have federal charter school money and we give out an application process. I can give priority points for diverse by design industry charter schools if I wanted to. We're on the last cycle of it. I walked into that, so when I go after it again, that is something I'm gonna look to do. There are things we can do through regulations. There are things we can do through all sorts of grant making. I have federal dollars right now that are good till 2024. There are things that I can do with that as well. And I do plan to push on that. But ultimately, if we're gonna take a more comprehensive approach, really it's gonna require both Annapolis, as well as the State Department of Ed, as well as the Housing Authority, essentially to come up with like an economically mobility package on how we really transform outcomes in this state, if we truly are, right? And that's gonna require housing, right? I mean, we have a wonderful organization called the Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership that essentially gives mobility vouchers for families to go to high opportunity neighborhoods. There are like 4,000 people on the wait list. And so there are things like that we can do. So there's a lot of things that can be done. And I think we're gonna talk about one of the most important reasons I came here is the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, which is a very amazing piece of legislation that none other that is going to invest billions of dollars over the next 10 years, and there's opportunities there to do it as well.
So that was my next question, which there's the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, which was landmark legislation passed a couple of years ago, will put an incredible amount of money targeted at specific problems across the state. And so I wanted to ask you, in the blueprint, there's nothing that was written that really incentivizes school integration. But I wanted to ask both of you if there are ways, even at this late date, to amend the blueprint or to put language in the blueprint that really incentivizes this?
There is actually one thing in the blueprint that actually seeks to create integrated learning environments. So one of the things in the blueprint, one aspect of the blueprint is to get closer to universal pre-K in our state. And it envisions a mixed delivery model of partnerships between public entities, school systems, and private providers. And there's a line in there. I don't know who convinced who to get it in, but I was like, I can work with that. And the line is essentially when you create early childhood learning experience, pre-K programs, do not concentrate, as practicable, do not concentrate basically recreate segregation and do not concentrate homogeneous populations and basically pursue integration where possible. And what every school system has to do and other relevant entities is go have an MOU between the department, the school system, and the provider, and the department gets to facilitate that experience, and then they also have to get approved by the AIB, which is this other entity, and that's one space that we can begin to do it. Now, I looked at it, I was like, okay, we're gonna integrate in early education, and then what's gonna happen? But, you know, if we're gonna start the conversation, that's a good place to start. So there is something in the blueprint to work with, and of course, like any law, you should be refining it over time.
I do know how it got in there. It was not a mistake. And look, I think
I will just add, that's not very much of the blueprint.
agreed. It's a tiny, tiny sliver. There is another part where it talks about the reporting of data in a way that is ideally can shine some light on some of the core issues. It does not forthright create a new policy lever or tool. I do think that there are opportunities as we move forward, particularly around CTE, our career and technology education in the secondary schools, where if we are creating more kind of regional specialized career and technology opportunities, there's the chance that students from multiple different schools, as these new types of 10th, 11th, 12th grades start to be developed, that we could be incentivizing more socioeconomic integrated enrollment for those opportunities, especially the ones that lead to high-end career pathways. So, I think there are places where it's possible, but there was nothing outright and explicit. I do think that the pre-K issue is an important one, because one of the big fights that we had is going to universal pre-K was how do you spend the money in what order? Do you give all low-income 3-year-olds the opportunity first, or do you take half of the eligible 3-year-olds and then half of income unqualified individuals, so that you can have a more diverse population enrolling? And so, this was a huge controversial issue that played out in the legislature. And so I think we got to a decent balance. But it is very, very hard. People immediately jump to what is happening in my school, and will my child be moved to a different school? And it's just a very hard conversation. Academically, it makes total sense. On the ground, it is much, much more challenging.
What do you to believe are the most successful and most doable models that foster integration? What you say that moving boundaries, school boundaries is one of the hardest, but it's also really effective, right?
Yes.
So, but what's the easiest to chip away at?
So open enrollment policies with guardrails. You have to, because open enrollment can just resegregate. You look at North Carolina charter schools, they're using charter schools to essentially create affluent schools to escape the urban school district. So I was going to get a clap for that, but then in San Antonio, I used charter schools to integrate the city. And I opened up the borders, because San Antonio, 90% Title I district, 90% Latino, with 17 districts all around it within 20 minutes of one another. I convinced the board launch in-district charters and open them up and do like a controlled choice model. I see Mr. Alves there, right? To essentially ensure that their schools were diverse by design. And we went from 0 to 10,000 over a 5-year period. Families opting out of A-rated affluent schools in a suburban district to come to San Antonio as urban core. So that, I would say, is very possible and doable. That's not, you're not gonna like make a massive dent on that, but you can push the conversation. So that's one thing I would say. The last thing I would say is incentives do matter. You know, you can get districts to do creative things, but incentives matter. We often give per pupil bumps for things like, you know, an ELL weight, a special education weight, but we never give a bump for like integration. You know, I worked on it did not become law. It's a Minnesota school segregation case that is looking to settle, and there's a bill filed that essentially try to create an integration bump. Like if you two districts partner together to reimagine your boundaries, reimagine your resources, then we will give you significant per pupil bumps to be able to pull this off. And so incentives do matter. And so that's something that we could look at as well at the state level. It's like housing tax credits to build, right, a set-asides for affordable housing. And so I'll just leave it at that in terms of what's possible.
I mean, I think I've been convinced that sort of the Chef Hartford school model, and I'm sure there's probably folks out here that know it much better than I do, seems to have been one of the most effective district-wide strategies. Of course, it took a court case, so you know that's not a necessarily available policy lever. I actually think that probably some of the best school integration policies are probably the best housing policies. So if you look at where we have in Maryland some of the more integrated schools socioeconomically, you know, one of them is Columbia. And Columbia was a farmland, massive farmland. Jim Rouse had this vision of creating a mixed income community of single family homes, of townhomes, of people of all races, backgrounds, income levels. And now Columbia, you know, I think it's 50 years later, roughly. I should know that, but I don't know the exact, 50 years? Something like that, 60 maybe, yep, is one of the most integrated and racially diverse areas of the state of Maryland. And so it was the housing policy and the housing stock that really drove it. Similarly, in Montgomery County, and I think the Century Foundation has actually done a really great report on this, in Montgomery County, there was a decision back in, you know, it was probably 70 years ago, 65, 70 years ago, that in any new development in Montgomery County, there was a set-aside requirement for affordable housing in that new development. And so in every community, you have the single-family homes and you have kind of townhomes that are a part of the community, and that has kind of created this more socioeconomically rich and diverse population for the neighborhood schools. So, you know, I do think that those are very, very critical components. They're you know, 60 years later, right? And I think that that's not in education. We want the next big thing to hit, and we solve the problem. I am not convinced that when it comes to socioeconomic integration, I don't think there's one big thing. I think it's lots of little things being tried, and then people stick with them over time to sort of see them play out.
We're going to go to housing for a minute. This politics of school and housing integration have always been really, really hard. Baltimore County has pledged to build 1,000 additional affordable housing units in higher income areas of the city by 2027, but the work keeps really being threatened by the county council. Years ago, Senator Barbara Mikulski, who was killed the Moving to Opportunity program. She was a very liberal congresswoman, which allowed low-income families to live in wealthy neighborhoods because there was just so much opposition. So what advice do you have for Bridges members navigating the politics of school and housing integration?
So I integrated in Texas, right? I often like to say my name is Mohammed, and I integrated blacks, Mexicans, and whites in Texas. So you could definitely pull some things off, right? And so and the argument there I made was, you know, an economic argument, right? And like an economic argument. It wasn't equity, it was an economic argument, right? Like, you want better outcomes, you want better schools, and I did use CTE as a framework over it as well, right? If we want a workforce that is ready, then we need to create socioeconomically diverse schools to develop critical thinking skills, collaboration skills, and have a workforce that is prepared to, right, jump into high demand fields. That worked, and to an extent, right? It's not a solution at scale, but I think you have to know your audience, right? I mean, Senator Van Hollen introduced a bipartisan bill. I'm forgetting with the Indiana senator, I think it's Senator Young. They both came together to expand mobility vouchers. They both came together to do that. And so there is bipartisan support on this. It's how you talk about it, right? And I think sometimes we, if you are a progressive individual who believes in this concept, you have to know your audience. And I got a lot of practice in my previous stomping grounds, but that matters as well. And so that's one advice that I would give. But yes, any big comprehensive solution is going to take the combination of the feds and the assembly to really come around a housing concept that seeks to create both inclusionary zoning as well as high opportunity areas that really seek to have all kinds of incomes together. And you can't just put the onus on Johnny Lavsky. You can't just put the onus on the county executive. That, I don't think that's smart long term. The legislator will have to ultimately come around with a massive package around that. So, to you.
Yeah, no, well, I just want to triple down. I want to triple down on the communication aspect of it. There is the message matters, the message matters, the message matters. And I think I'm a firm believer in it, and ever more so now serving in this capacity. And look, I'm a politician, so take what I say with a grain of salt, because it's like in my own incentive and world. I deeply, 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 deeply believe in meeting people where they are and moving them to where you want them to be. And so to meet somebody where they are may mean that it's an uncomfortable conversation where both, we're finding common interests. And then we can move them down the spectrum. And so I think that in this kind of political environment, in a world of social media and tweeting that is, 160 characters, it's very hard to do that. And so that's where kind of face-to-face conversations, late night community meetings, you have real conversations. What do you care about? What do you want for your children? You want them to be successful in the 21st century world? Well, this is a globalized world where you need to be able to interact with somebody that did not have the same background as you. That is not something that you can teach in a book. That can only come through experience. And so if your child's school only has more children like them, they are going to be less competitive in the 21st century. And that is just a fact. And, people want their kids to be successful. Doesn't matter what your background is, your race, your class, how much money you have. We all want the same thing. We want our kids to be better off than we were. And so, that common value can start the conversation and then move people down the spectrum. I just think the communication of it matters so, so, so much.
I have just one last question, and that is how bad do you think the political environment is right now? I mean, is it more likely, will it get better in a couple more years, or do you just start where you are now? What's the outlook?
I have the Ted Lasso outlook. Look, I mean, I haven't seen the second season, so if it gets worse, don't tell me. Look, I think nothing is inevitable, right? Everything is changeable. And so we create the world we want it to be. Yes, there are a lot of headwinds. There are a lot of really challenging features of the world right now. It is really tough, but something's going to break through. I mean, the power of humanity is amazing. And so I think that good people banding together to create a better opportunity is the only thing throughout human history that has worked. And so it is a tough time, and we all have to figure out kind of what our role is in this new media market, in this world of fear and kind of a post-COVID world. But, and I'm going to do one last history point, throughout human time, after pandemics, the years following pandemics are some of the most collaborative and creative and innovative times in human history. And that makes sense because everybody's had to reevaluate what they care about. The problem is it can also go in the other direction. I choose to believe that we have this moment. We are amongst this privileged few, the first in 100 years that get to reshape the world in the post-pandemic world. And so I am very hopeful. I think this is an amazing period of time for humanity, and good people have to stand up.
I am hopeful too, and I think, America is diversifying whether you want it to or not. It's gonna happen. And so, and you are going to either embrace that and work with that and understand the value and beauty and if you have an economic heart on that, seeing an economic gain in that, and it's gonna happen. And I'm hopeful when you look at leadership and the changing face of leadership, you see, I often pay a lot of attention to what's happening in our suburbs because there is, I hate using this word, but it's the best I got for today, natural integration happening, right, with people from all walks of life, just because of housing, how it was built, or people experience economic mobility and moving into it. So, and those people are going to run for school board, and they're going to run for council, and they're going to run for, to be governor. And I am hopeful. It's going to be messy. It's not going to be a quick fix, but I'm hopeful that it will happen. And on the education front, which has become a thing to assault in a wide variety of ways. It's very important that we stay focused on student learning. It's very important that we stay focused on, building, serving a purpose around building a strong democracy, all of those things. And I'm gonna be very consistent with that. I told my team we cannot get dragged into these culture wars, and I'm fortunate to have a state board of education who is focused on that. So I'm hopeful. I'm not hopeful in a way where it's, it's all kumbaya, but I'm hopeful that the tensions are gonna lead to better ideas. So.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you for your presentation. I'm just curious. It's one thing to integrate any given space, right? Classroom, school. It's another thing to leverage the presence of diversity for positive outcomes, learning. How do you make that work? So what are you doing in the space of developing leadership and instructors' capacity to really effectively teach and make that diversity work? What are you doing in that space?
Yeah, that's a great question for the state superintendent. And so, so I'm finishing up 1 year. I am developing a strategic plan with the state board, but there are things I know I want to do. And there are things I know that are tried and true, but I got to bring, and I want to bring community along. That matters, but you can't just go out and get ahead in front of community, right? We really truly need to change how we prepare teachers. Let's start on the beginning of the pipeline, right? In terms of what competencies, right? In higher ed, right? I'm coming for you too, in terms of how you are preparing our teachers, right? So what cultural competencies, right? Right now we are in a high stakes moment where we have these draft regulations out for comment. And those regulations define competencies, define how many hours a teacher intern has to do, all sorts of things. That's the space where we can mandate the science of reading and all those things. There is a section in there around cultural competencies and what that needs to look like in educator preparation programs. So that's one space right there, right? Then you have all the educators who are already in the space, right? And so as a department, right, we have to ensure that we are uplifting and promoting and reinforcing and incentivizing and sometimes, if necessary, mandating, right, cultural competency training. So that does matter. And I'm more used to on the mandating side, so I am learning the art of the other side as well too. And I think it's the balance of both. And so, and it is top of mind for me. Maryland has something called COMAR. It's the regulations that dictate what school systems can or cannot do. It's a very powerful lever. And I have been reading them late at night, every night, combing through them to see what can be done and what cannot be done. Yeah. Yeah, meaning that everyone who works for our district in San Antonio ISD or Dallas ISD, you coming in will be required to go through a set of trainings and commitments that require you to be culturally competent. And if you don't want to, then we don't want you teaching our children. Yeah.
So, and I think the context here is, one of the issues in Maryland that is a very historic and powerful force is the issue of local control. And so we have the State Board of Education, which under the law has the authority to mandate. But with 24 counties, as each county is its own school district, there is a strong history of balance between local control and state authority and state mandates for lots of different issues. You name the issue, it's come up. And so that is the tension that the superintendent walks into, is that each individual superintendent, we can say we want cultural competency, but we'll define what that means in our jurisdiction in our own specific way. And so that's where that tension hits very hard. And so, it's about making it a value and following through.
I'm excited to run into that tension and see what happens.
Yes.
My question was about, I know in our state, in North Carolina, we're experiencing teacher shortages. I'm curious if you're also experiencing those, especially with talk about mandates for extra training and things like that for teachers. Curious probably why you're talking about finding that other path.
Yeah, we are experiencing shortages, but I like to bring nuance to that conversation. Maryland's retention rate is 90% and has held steady on that. But there are individual schools and communities and pockets of area that do have larger vacancies. So I was at a middle school today in Prince George's County, and she has 4 vacancies in core content areas. And no one often talks about, people always talk about like teacher attrition and just education in general. You dissect that by middle school, it's even higher. I was a middle school person. It takes a special kind of person to be working with children with all sorts of hormonal growth and challenges. But what I am saying there is we are experiencing that. Less and less people want to be educators. Less and less people are choosing to remain. And some things have been true for a while. Not a lot of people are lining up to go teach in West Baltimore, right? And you show me the lowest poverty schools in a district, I'll show you where the most tenured teachers are. That's been true even before the pandemic. And so, I do think there are things that teachers who teach and commit to areas like West Baltimore or concentrated poverty, right? I believe they do deserve more, frankly, both financially and support-wise too. But we don't do that. We don't build systems for that. So that's something I'm hoping to push on. But in terms of pipeline, one of the things that I've invested in with our ESSER dollars is grow your own. I really have to tackle the pipeline early on. So all of our school systems have submitted proposals from taking their teacher assistants and turning them to teachers, to taking high school students, to turning them into teachers. And we got to do it in a very thoughtful way. You got to do it in a way where you subsidize the debt. You got to have a good starting pay. You got to make sure licensure does not get into the way. I want to have that conversation with you. There are many different things you have to do. And you got to make sure induction and mentorship is strong in the beginning. So I'm thinking about the entire thing. Yeah.
Only thing I would add on the shortage is just the shortage on mental health workers and access to mental health workers, which I think right now is so unbelievably important. We've put a lot of money behind trying to make access to mental health services greater for young people in schools, in all schools. The challenge is we don't have the people to fill it. So the money is there, but we don't have the qualified professionals with the certifications to do that service. So I think it is ever more important now as we move forward.
We got time for one last question before we close it.
All right, I'm coming. Who said it? No? Can you introduce yourself? Oh,
We're not going to have time for a last question.
Okay. Okay, my name is Larry Burnley. I'm the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Shaker Heights City Schools. Critical race theory. So as you know, as we all know, there's this, what I call an intentional distortion, an effort to undermine efforts to help students think critically about policy and practice as it relates to race and other identities over time and how it's informed the persistence of these disparities that we're seeing? What are you doing in the state? How are you addressing this? I'm interested about, Texas. Texas historically, as Arizona had to deal with the attack against Rasa studies, that was effective, legislation passed. What are you doing? This dominant narrative that's really, again, distorting how how people are thinking about the need to develop intercultural competencies and have the complex conversations either in professional learning or teaching. How are you navigating this space here in Maryland, and what are your thoughts for us in terms of how we might think about coming up with a counter narrative?
We are not going to get sucked into, right, these manufactured crises around 3 letters that really have nothing to do with anything about what happens in our classroom each and every day. And I will not compromise on good old-fashioned equity work that has been true from the civil rights era, that's been true from NCLB, and which was passed by Republicans, right, and has strong bipartisan support. And that's something that we have decided to stay true to. And I am not going to relent to that. My state board's not going to give up to that. Every time I get sucked in an interview in that, I basically say that that's not something, that has nothing to do with what's happening in our schools. Are you telling me that I am not supposed to differentiate for our English language learners, our special education students, our black students, our whatever student is and whatever walks of life? And then when you say that, it's hard to keep talking, right? Because it's like, well, that's not what I'm saying. Okay, then what are you saying, all right? Because what I'm saying is I'm trying to design an education system that's designed for all students to succeed. And so if you're with me on that, great. But if you want to talk about something that is completely, has nothing to do with what is actually happening in our classrooms, I don't have time for you.
That's the last word? All right. Well, we want to invite all of you to join us downstairs for happy hour and hors d'oeuvres, and we want to take one more opportunity to just say thank you so much to our wonderful panel. Thank you so much for spending your time.
Thank you all.